Um, and we'll start. I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'm going to show you a map of kind of where we're going. So this should be coming up on your screen now. May take a little time because of the lag on Zoom, but hopefully you're beginning to see a Google map which shows what I think of as a spiral. And it shows the trees which I'm going to talk about, starting with the first one, which is Hadley Green, way up in the very north of London. And this is a tree that I wrote about in London is a Forest. It's right on the edge of Barnet and pretty much marks the end of London, where London meets Hertfordshire. It's on the A1000, which is the road to St Albans. And it's a boundary tree, like many trees that have survived for a long time tend to be boundary trees, which means that they were planted to mark a boundary at some point. And they've often been pollarded or coppiced in the past well, essentially now that means that their lifespan has increased and they've been maintained. I thought this tree was a maiden, that is a tree which has never been pollarded. But when I went to see it, it had its leaves on. And with the beauty of Street View, we can see it in the winter with no leaves on. And you can see the structure of this tree, which looks to me like it may well have been pollarded, maybe in more recent times than when it was planted. I reckon it's about 200 years old. I'm going to take you through some other views of it as well. So the beauty of Street View allows you to see it at different seasons. So that's in March 2019, and now we're going to June 2017. And you can see the splendor of this tree in its prime foliage. So this is an English oak, that's Quercus robur, differs from the sessile oak, which is Quercus petrea, the two native oaks to the UK. Quercus robur, also known as the pedunculate oak. And the difference between them is quite subtle. The English oak has leaves, or the pedunculate oak has leaves which have no stalk and acorns on stalks, and the sessile oak is the other way around. Sessile oaks tend to be more concentrated in sort of western areas of the UK. There are some in London, and some of the more magnificent oak trees in London are in fact sessile oaks. So this is a really fascinating tree, I think. I'm going to take us back to another view. I'm going to go to the so this is now you should be seeing the another picture of the Monk and Hadley oak. This is one which I took in the summer a couple of years ago, and you can see just how magnificent that is. The next tree I'm going to take you to is much further east. So while you can feast your eyes on the Monk and Hadley oak, while I get the next one lined up for you. So this is another oak tree, and it's again on the edge of London. Like the Monk and Hadley oak, it's possibly a boundary tree. It's certainly been here for a long time, and some people reckon it's the oldest street tree in London, which I think is pretty interesting. It's right on the border with Essex, and I'm going to take you to have a look at this one. So this is Little Gaines Lane in Upminster. Little Gaines Lane has this really fantastic old oak tree, which completely fills the pavement. And what you can see is that the local authority are very carefully built around it, and the house on the corner there has managed to be not included in its own garden. So it's still in the public realm and people can walk past it. If we look up at it, you can see that this tree has been pollarded and has been managed quite well over quite recent years, I would say, judging by where those branches have been cut. It's thought that this tree is about 250 years old. I'm going to get another view of it. And you can see that possibly around the base there, it's been hemmed in the past and it's been freed more recently. I'll see whether we can find a picture of it with its leaves on. So this is October 2014. And there it is with its full foliage, just beginning to go a little yellow at the edges as the autumn begins to cut in. So the little Gaines Lane in Upminster, one of the oldest street tree in London, perhaps. I think it certainly is a contender. I don't know of any other very old trees like that. I certainly are some old trees around in other parts of London, but whether they're quite this old, I'm not sure. And we'll look at some of these trees as well. So the next one I'm going to take you to is, just going to go to the map, and I'm going to show you, it's down in Croydon. So while I'm going to go there, I'm going to share an image of that tree. So just coming up on your screen now will be an image of Oaks Lane in Croydon. So I'm going to go there, and we're going to have a look at the trees there. So this is Oaks Road, perhaps it is. Yeah, Oaks Road. And Oaks Road is well named because obviously it has these oaks along it. So just on one side of the street are a load of fairly recently built houses. When I say recently built, I would say that they're 20th century. So I'm going to take you back to that tree on Street View. And here it is, the Oaks Road oak. And this one has, it's quite fascinating because it's got two stems. So you can see on this one that it's possibly been coppiced in the past. So the two sort of commonly encountered management techniques for tree are pollarding, where the branches are lopped at a certain height, which is above the browse line for cattle and deer and so on. And it's to allow the new shoots to grow without being nibbled away by cattle or other herbivores. This one, though, appears to have been coppiced, and coppice is when a tree is cut right down at the base, and that happens when particularly trees are harvested for timber, or for wood, in fact. There's a difference between timber and wood, and I'll come on to that a bit later. So this one's been cut at the base, and you can see it's grown several stems, and you often see this in some of London's remarkable bits of old woodland, ancient woodland, that have managed to cling on, where you see coppice trees which have become much larger, and they've been allowed to grow because coppicing hasn't occurred for many years, often over 100 years. And here, this I'd say is older than that. Across the road is the Addington Hills Park, which is full of ancient trees. Fascinating place to go and visit. So there are quite a few oaks on this, but as we move into the centre of London, we're going to see some more. Now, I mentioned that there are two types of oak trees that are commonly encountered. The English oak, or the two native species, should I say, the English oak or pedunculate oak. And coming up on your screen now is an image of the leaves of an English or pedunculate oak. And you can see that those leaves have no stalks where they attach themselves to the twigs. With a sessile oak, it's the other way around. So that's how you can tell which type you have. And of course, to make it more confusing, these two species can interbreed. So you might see some that are in between that have both leaves on stalks, short stalks, and acorns on stalks as well. So the best time to go and have a look is in the autumn, when you see both the acorns and the leaves at the same time. Right, so the next one I'm going to take you to is going to be a completely different kind of tree. So let me move on the slideshow. So coming up on your slideshow now is a tree which is quite an exotic species, which you may not recognize. But if anybody's got any ideas, if they chuck it in the chat, we can maybe see whether anybody knows what it is. And bonus points for Latin names, by the way, as well. So I'm not monitoring the chat, I hasten to add, so Andrew will have to judge that, and he will probably agree that you're absolutely correct. This is, of course, a golden rain tree, and golden rain trees are trees which come from China and East Asia. It has an alternative name of the pride of India, but of course it doesn't actually grow in India, so I'm not quite sure how it got that name. The golden rain tree seems most apt to me because it has these yellow flowers in the high summer, in about July, and these are preceded by these coral leaves. So for a few fleeting days in April, when the leaves start to appear, they're this beautiful coral color, and the whole tree becomes coral colored. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and try and find this on Streetview, and we can have a look at it in the seasons. So what's I think sort of fascinating about this tree as well is, of course, that it's outside a tube station. So it's a bit of a local landmark. It's a tree which, if ever you find yourself at Osterley Station, why would you, unless you live in Osterley, of course, or you're an architecture buff, because of course Osterley Station is one of those fantastic modernist stations on the Piccadilly line of great architectural merit. It was built in the 1930s. I've seen some photographs of Osterley Station from that time, and the tree wasn't there. Even though this is one of the largest golden rain trees I know, it suggests that it's not that old. So it's clearly less than 100 years old, and probably more like 50 years old. So we're going to go back in time and see what we can see of this tree in different seasons. So this is just coming up on your screen is April 2018. And you can see that there's no leaves on that tree at that time. And unfortunately, when Streetview car was driving past this tree, it wasn't able to capture those. It was the wrong moment to capture those coral leaves. But you never know, we may still be able to find an image of that if we go back even further. But what I have found is July 2015. And coming up here is the tree in full bloom. Well, it's actually beginning to be a bit over. You can see that the yellow flowers are beginning to fade a bit, and those flowers turn into seed pods. You can also see down the road another golden rain tree just beyond that black car. There is a second golden rain tree. Oh, there it is. So what golden rain trees have become very good at in London is seeding themselves. And indeed, if you go along parts of the district line, you'll often see golden rain trees in West London that are growing along the side of the railway track, a bit like a sycamore or another one of those favourite trees that likes to colonise the edgelands of London, which is, of course, the tree of heaven, which is another story. But the golden rain tree, I think, is a really fantastically attractive tree, and one that I'd like to see more of. There are quite a few street trees, but this is, I think, the biggest one I know. There is another great one in the garden of the Charterhouse in Holborn or Clerkenwell, and if you go along the road there on the top deck of a bus, you can see it poking over the wall. I'm just going to share another image with you. So on my coming up on your screen now, going back to the coral new foliage. Another interesting thing about this is that it has pinnate leaves. So that means multiple leaflets on a single stem. Sometimes those can be bipinnate. So not only do they split once, they split a second time as well. So it can be really quite an attractive tree just from the foliage. And then the other thing which is attractive about it is, of course, the blossom. And this is the golden rain flowers, which then by the autumn, they'll turn into seed pods. And I'm going to show you these next. So hopefully the flowers have come up for you. I know there's a bit of a lag on Zoom between photographs appearing and me rambling on about them. So I'll give it enough time for that to appear. And the next one coming up are the seed pods. So the seed pods appear in the autumn and they go through these sort of brown orange color, and they can persist on the trees for several months. So in kind of January, February, they're still there. They've pretty much disappeared by March. So this is a tree which I like to think is a tree for all seasons. It has this spring interest with the leaves, summer interest with the flowers, autumn and winter interest with the seeds. So fascinating tree. So what's next on my great street view tree tour of London is going to be another fascinating tree. So this is going to go up to Wembley for this one, and I'm just trying to remember where indeed that tree is. It's now just bear with me while I get to that. So if you know if you go to Wembley for any sports fixtures, you may well have seen this tree, if I can find it. So there it is. Unfortunately, I don't have any pictures of this, so we're going to have to make do with the street view, but it's a really fascinating tree, this one. So I'm going to move back onto Street View, and we're going to have a look at what is the Wembley Elm. So this is outside a pub called the Arch, and it's a very unusual type of elm. So if you are aware of elms, they're not very common in London. There are quite a few younger elms, but there are not very many old elms. And this is one of the very few old elms. There is another one which is coming up, which I'll talk to you about a bit later. But this one is a European white elm. That's Ulmus leavis. There are two that I know of in London. The other one is in Ladywell Fields in South London, but it's not very street viewable, that one. In fact, if you know that tree, which is an official Great Tree of London, it's actually marked incorrectly in the park. So you heard it here first, that that's actually a European white elm. So I'm going to, actually I do have an image of that. So I'm going to take you back to my image and we can have a look at that one. So this is an image which I photographed, which I took several years ago in the winter on a very bright day. And you can see the arches of Wembley Stadium. So if ever you're up at Wembley for a football match, this is the one to go and have a look at. Right, I'm going to, I realise we've got about 25 minutes to go, so I'm going to have to get a bit of a speed on. Right, so the next one, we're going back to East London. So we're going to Wood Street in Walthamstow. And if anybody knows that one, they may already be going, of course, the Wood Street horse chestnut. And the Wood Street horse chestnut is a famous tree in the East End of London. And it's a really magnificent tree. And I'm going to come and get a bit of a closer look at it. And we'll move on to this one. Right, so horse chestnuts, of course, are under a bit of duress at the moment with the leaf miner attack, which they get from it's actually the leaf miner is a very small caterpillar of a micro moth that tunnels its way into the leaves and eats the leaves from the inside out, which causes horse chestnut leaves to go very brown. It's a pest which hasn't been here for very long, but it is ravaging our horse chestnut population. The horse chestnuts, though, do survive. They're fine. Every spring they'll come back into leaf and have a beautiful display of fresh green leaves and the wonderful candle flowers as well. So this is the Wood Street horse chestnut, which stands guard over this little clapboard building, which is 200 years old. It's now a health food shop. It was a butcher's, apparently. Whether the tree is that old, I don't know. 200 years for a horse chestnut would be pretty old. I'm going to see what we can see on the street view, see whether we can find it in flower. But here's an image from August 2017. So just coming up on your screen now is that tree in August 2017, and you can see the brown tinge to the leaves, which is the leaf miner attack, the leaf mining caterpillar, which is ravaging the leaves of this tree. I was talking to an ecologist recently who told me that there's been some activity amongst some tits that are beginning to feed on the larvae of this, on these leaf miner caterpillars. So there is some hope, perhaps, but I think they're going to have to eat an awful lot of them, and I imagine they're very small. So I can't imagine that's going to be particularly nourishing for any bird, but there's certainly going to be enough of them. Let's see what we can find. I think Street View is going to let us down. Oh, here we have May 2015. And it's not a fantastic image, but you can see the flower candles on this tree. So there it is, the horse chestnut in full bloom. And that's quite a sight, I think, and a really magnificent tree, the Wood Street horse chestnut. So the next one I'm going to take you to is we're going back to South London. And this one is in Sydenham. And this is the Lorry Park oak tree. So this is another fantastic old oak tree. And what's interesting about this one is that it marks the boundary. It's a boundary tree, and it's been there for a very long time. It's on a traffic island all of its own on Lorry Park Avenue in Sydenham, near Crystal Palace. And this tree, which I'm going to share a picture of on Street View, marks the boundary between the London boroughs of Bromley, Lewisham and Lambeth. So it still is the boundary. So it still marks the boundary. It hasn't stopped being a boundary tree. And I think it's really great that the local authorities have allowed it to remain in place and have built around it. What's also interesting about this tree, or about this street, in fact, Lorry Park in Sydenham, is that this, of course, is where the painter Camille Pissarro, the French Impressionist, lived when he was in London for a few years. And at the end of this street, which I'm hoping will be appearing on your screen shortly, is a church. And he painted this view. It's a painting which is in the National Gallery of the church in Sydenham. And there's a bit of artistic license which he's put into it. So the view is rather different to this. And what I'd like to think, though, is that he was under the canopy of that oak tree, which would have been a mature tree when he painted this scene in the 1870s. I haven't got a picture of that to share with you, I'm afraid, but just imagine that one to look up, I think, Pissarro's view of Lorry Park Drive in Sydenham. So what have we got next? I'm going to take you to, we're going to go to Putney next. So Let me see whether I can get that up for you. And what we're going to see is a very, very old tree that was obviously another marker tree, or some tree which somehow survived the building of houses. And this is in what would have been Putney Heath. Now it's in a housing development. And I'm going to take you directly to that tree now. Let's have a look at that, unless I had already done that. But so this is a sweet chestnut, Castanea sativa. They're pretty common in London, particularly in South London, a lot of them in the woodlands there. It's a tree which is not a native tree, but it acts like a native tree, and you'll find it in our ancient woodlands, introduced by the Romans, potentially as a source of timber, which is what it's been traditionally used as in the UK, but also potentially as a source of food, because this produces the sweet chestnuts. Unrelated to the horse chestnut, which is an aesculus, has completely different leaves, but similar looking fruit. And this one at this point is in flower, which is quite dramatic. They're nothing like the flower candles of a horse chestnut. They're these spikes which turn into the very, very spiny cupules is the technical term for the casings within which the fruits of the sweet chestnut are held. And I'm going to see whether we can find a view of this in the winter. Well, here's April, and that van has mercifully moved, and we can see how this tree completely blocks the pavement down here on Heathview Gardens in Putney, a rather swanky address. I can see that it's obviously spilling over the pavement as well. So it looks like the council, which I believe would be Wandsworth or possibly Richmond there, might be needing to do a little bit of, give it a bit of help with some engineering to free it a bit more. But I think it's really amazing that they've seen the value of keeping this old tree in situ. And whilst it means that that paved path is completely impassable, and it probably fails on all sorts of health and safety grounds, that it's been retained, and obviously the residents appreciate it being there, and any pedestrian has to step out into the street. So anyway, I'm very, very thankful that that tree has survived there. Just going to go back to the map and let's see where we are. So we're going to go back to Ealing is the next one, and we're going to go to I think it's Carlton Road in Ealing. And this is another fascinating tree. Let me move this on for you. So here we have it. It's even marked on Google Maps there. It says the Carlton Road Ancient Oak. And live on Street View, I'm going to take you to the rather not that amazing looking tree, but it's right in the middle of the road. They've built the road around it. It's called the Elephant Tree. And I don't know whether anybody is from West London or Ealing and knows this tree, but it's called the Elephant Tree because apparently an elephant is buried under it. Now, this story is obviously a bit of a myth, or is it? The tree is very old. It's probably 200 years old, probably not quite as old as the Little Gaines Lane oak in Upminster, but this tree is certainly well over a century, if not 2 centuries old. It's probably a marker tree as well, survived in the road. And what is known is that in the early 20th century, there was a circus troupe that was marching through Ealing on their way to Ealing Common, where they were going to set up their circus. And with the circus was a bunch of elephants. And one of those elephants sadly died and was buried on the spot. Now, it's untrue that the tree was buried to mark the grave of the elephant, but the elephant was clearly, was potentially buried near here. Now, I thought that was a myth, but I did this tour a few weeks ago, and there was a gardener who works nearby, and she got in touch with me and told me that she was gardening in a garden here, and she dug up a huge knuckle bone, which she said could only have been that of an elephant. So some mythical trees, the myths might be true after all. So that's the elephant tree in Ealing. Now we're going to go back to my map, and from here we're going to go to Finsbury Park. So I'm going to move on to another screen. So this is the almond tree at Finsbury Park coming up on your screen now, in flower. Well, this is not the tree itself, but these are the flowers of an almond tree. And almonds used to be a lot more common. They seem to be out of fashion, so you don't see so many of them, but they're very, very beautiful trees. They are one of the first trees to flower in London. They will flower, and particularly the one that I'm going to talk to you about. It flowers in January some years. In fact, it flowered in January this year. It has pink flowers. Some almonds have white flowers. But this one is also remarkable for not only the time that it flowers, but also because of the time that it has been in the place where it has been. And I'm going to move on back to Street View and show you the tree itself. So just coming up, I'll give you Nando's, and across the road from Nando's is the Finsbury Park almond tree, which somehow has survived in this little flower bed. It's not very old, maybe 50 years old, but it's got this amazing corkscrew trunk, and it's a local landmark for people that live in this part of London. I'm one of them. So I've been noticing this tree for years, and many of my neighbours have as well. And it's a tree which I think has an unofficial, not really a boundary tree, but it's an unofficial marker tree. It's sort of certainly a tree which is a local landmark. And I think as we get into central London, we're going to see more trees like this, that are trees which are significant for people for reasons of familiarity, local landmarks. And what I kind of love about this tree is, as I say, the fact that it flowers in very early, but it's this remarkable trunk, which you can see, I hope. It is a corkscrew, and it double backs on itself. And how that happened, I've no idea. And how the tree survived, I have no idea. And you can see that this is in March 2019. It's finished flowering. I'm going to go and see whether I can see some, and this is March 2018, and this is it in flower. So here you have it in March 2018. You remember the winter of 2017-2018 was when we had the beast from the east, the first snow we've had in London for years, the last snow we had in London. And everything, it was a very late spring. So in that year, this tree flowered in March. In other years, it's January or February. February is more common. This year, it was January. And another thing which is interesting about almonds is they have these very long leaves. Almonds, of course, are prunus, so they're related to the cherries, the peaches, the plums, and the apricots. On this tree, on this specimen, you can see that the defining factor is, of course, these long leaves. They're quite glossy, and at this time of year, they're prone to leaf curl in the UK. And can look a little bit wilted. At this time, this was May 2017, this one doesn't appear to have any leaf curl, but you can see in the canopy, I don't know whether you can see that, it might be a bit difficult on some screens, but you can see some almonds beginning to grow. Now, I've never tried the almonds off this tree, but there could be some thought they may be edible, who knows? They certainly ripen very nicely. Almonds could be a crop of the future. The urban foragers of Finsbury Park could be looking out for those. So what else have I got to show you? So I think the next tree we're going to go to is in South London. So I'm going to take you back to my screen, and I'm going to show you where we're going to next. This is Brixton, and Brixton is home to a magnificent plane tree, which is truly one of the great street viewable trees in London, I think. This is the Windrush Square plane, which is right outside the Ritzy Cinema, opposite Lambeth Town Hall in Brixton. And it's a tree which has been planted, must have been planted probably 150 years ago. It is now in a square of its own. That wasn't necessarily a pedestrianised square some years ago. And now it's become this local landmark. It's been, well, people have obviously loved this tree for a long time. This was also one of the original great trees of London. So in 1987, after the Great Storm, which some of you may remember, the Great Storm devastated trees in the southeast of England. Many were lost, many survived, but of the ones that were lost, or of the ones which survived rather, a call out was made to nominate some great trees, and a list of 41 great trees of London were devised, which the public voted on, and this was one of them. Back then, it was known as the Tate Plane, because the library at Brixton is the Tate Library. Since then, this area has been renamed Windrush Square, so it seems much more appropriate to call it the Windrush Square plane rather than the Tate plane. So that's what I like to call it, and I've included it in my Great Trees of London map as the Windrush Square plane, as I've updated the list for the 21st century. So I think that's a magnificent example of a London plane. Next on my list, where are we going? Oh, we missed one out. I think we're probably going to have to miss that one out because we're running a bit late. But the next one is a stunner. You're going to like this one. So I'm going to take you back to the other screen and show you a picture of this tree. And again, this is one which there's a, if anyone can tell us what this is, type it into the chat. Bonus point for the Latin name as well, while I fiddle around and get us to it on Streetview. So it's in Pimlico, and it is an Australian tree. And being Australian, it's fairly tender. Obviously, the Australian climate is rather different to the London climate, but when you get into the centre of London, there's this thing of the urban heat island, which means that the climate, the microclimate within the city is quite warm, and particularly at night, it can be considerably warmer than it is during in outlying parts of the UK. So if you went to Essex, it might be 5 to 10 degrees cooler at night than it is in London, in the centre of London. So I'm going to take you back to Street View, and we're going to have a look at this tree on Street View. And of course, kudos to everybody that typed in the chat that this is, of course, a mimosa or a silver wattle. The Latin name is Acacia dealbata. It's an acacia. And it's a tree that you'll often see in the West Country, actually. So if you're down in Devon or Cornwall, these trees are quite popular in back gardens. They're incredibly rapid growers. So here it is and another great thing about these trees, like the almond, they flower very, very early. I've been in this street in January and it's been in flower. It's often in February, and this one is March 2019, it's in flower. Whoops, going the wrong way there. Well, we can have a look at it from this direction. So what's fascinating about this, as we're on Moreton Terrace, is that there's a bit of a urban myth about why this was planted, and I'll get onto that in a minute, but I'm just going to go back to 2008 because I can on Street View, and we can have a look at this tree as a tiny sapling, and there it is, virtually nothing there. It must have been planted probably a year or two before that. That little sapling has turned into what has become an absolutely huge tree in the space of 11 years. here it is, looking much larger. Now, the street that it blocks the end of, Moreton Terrace in Pimlico, is where a former Prime Minister of Australia, Billy Hughes, was born in the 19th century. And he lived there until he emigrated to Australia. I don't know when that was. He became the Prime Minister of Australia, and he was the Prime Minister of Australia during this First World War. There's a blue plaque commemorating him on this house that he lived in. And further up this street are trees which are also Australian. And we might have a quick look to see these rather bizarre trees. And here's one of them. It's a bottlebrush tree, which is a weird Australian tree which has red flowers. And when it's in flower, it looks much nicer than it does when it's not in flower. And I'll see whether Streetview has managed to capture it in flower. It flowers for a very long period, so I would be surprised if we don't find a street view of it in flower. But I'm not sure Streetview is going to come good on us for this one. Let's have a look in September 2017. Oh, there's one in flower up the street, I think. Oh no, that was a window box. Haha, foiled again. Anyway, the bottlebrush trees and the mimosa of Pimlico, I asked one of the tree officers at Westminster Council, who managed the trees in this part of London, whether that was the case, that it was there to commemorate Billy Hughes, the former Prime Minister of Australia. And they had said they had no idea about how those trees got there. So it's still a bit of a mystery, but I'm sure that must have something to do with it. Coming up on your screen now is the wonderful pom-pom-like blossoms of mimosa, which are also have a wonderful heady scent. So walking past this tree in the late winter is an absolutely uplifting thing to do, because the scent is really intoxicating, and they are absolutely festooned with flowers. And even if it's a sunny day in January, you'll often see bees on it as well. So the next tree I'm going to take you to, which is our penultimate tree, is another elm tree. And I'm going to get back onto, so this is in Marylebone. It's Marylebone High Street, and this is a Huntingdon elm. So Huntingdon elms were probably one of the more common elms that you would see in London. Even elms have never been particularly common in London, but the ones that we had would likely be this species or other types of species, elms that would have been very susceptible to Dutch elm disease. Now I'm going to take you to have a look at this one. So this is, as I say, a Huntingdon elm. It's remarkably survived Dutch elm disease. It's huge. It's on Marylebone High Street, and it absolutely towers over the street and is worth going to check out. So I imagine many of you frequently go shopping in the Conran shop on Marylebone High Street, and it's just opposite that. So when you've restocked with new cutlery and new ceramics after we're allowed out again, go and have a look at the Marylebone High Street elm. This must be 150 years old.
Paul, can I interrupt you?
Of course.
We can't see the Huntingdon elm. We can't see it.
Oh no.
No, we see Paul Wood has started sharing his screen, but we can't actually see the tree. Do you have a picture of it nearby, or?
Well, it's on my screen. I think it must be the bandwidth, I'm afraid. I'll move on to the next one and see what we can find. But I'm afraid the next one's a Street View tree as well. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm afraid you're going to have to look at me for a little while I move on to the next one. I'm sorry you couldn't see that, and I'm afraid I don't have any pictures of it, but it is a really magnificent tree. The final tree.
We can see you, Paul, but we can't see the tree. That's a shame.
Well, yeah, there you go. Have to make do with second best, I'm afraid. But I'm going to remedy that very shortly with another tree, which is going to be a really remarkable tree. This is my favourite tree in the City of London. So hopefully this one will come up when I get onto screen share. Now, within a few seconds, I'm hoping this will appear on your screens. And this is the Cheapside Plane. And this is a very old plane tree in the City of London. It's a huge tree. It's a London plane. Most London planes in London, you may be surprised to know, are actually relatively young, in that most of the older ones are 150 years old. Many are younger than that. Most planes were planted between 1870 and 1914 in London. But this one is possibly 300 years old, and is certainly a tree which has been around for for a great deal of time. What's remarkable about it is that it stopped development in the city. So you can see in front of it these low-rise buildings, or can you?
No, we can't, Paul. Unfortunately, we can't. We only have it's saying Paul Wood sharing screen. I've turned off everyone's video because someone suggested that improved bandwidth, but I think that might be a myth. So I'm afraid, I think the best bet is, unless Paul, you can keep fiddling around, we take some questions off the chat, don't you?
Yeah, why not? I'm going to try and put you onto another screen, and then we can come back to that, and hopefully this one will appear. These are my books, so that is something which very keen to get across to you all. Has that appeared?
No.
No. Okay. So what I'd thought about questions is perhaps people, if they had any, if you wanted to pick some out, Andrew, and
yeah,
maybe
there are a couple of juicy ones here, actually.
Okay, great.
So if Deeran would like to unmute himself and ask his question, if he's forgotten it, I'll find it here on the chat just to remind you. So Deeran, if you're there, you asked a question there at 6:32.
Yeah, my question was about these boundary trees and how, I guess originally they were kind of separating local authorities, but now they're used within kind of boroughs to also separate kind of public and private space, particularly for like large scale regeneration projects. So on one side of the street, you'll have like the original landscape. On the other side of the street, you have kind of brand new trees and kind of not intertwined with the original landscape because that's private space. I was just wondering what your thoughts and views were on that, and if you see that as becoming more common within London or other cities.
I'm sure it is becoming more common, but I think that boundary trees have always marked boundaries, and some of those boundaries are quite obscure, but they probably still exist. So the one I showed you in South London at the Lorry Park boundary tree was still marks a very significant boundary between individual boroughs. But other boundary trees might mark something like where, person A's land ends and person B's does, but those boundaries may not be significant any longer. And things like parish boundaries and so on, and ward boundaries, which are still important, but boundaries which we as 21st century inhabitants of the city are probably not so aware of. But then I think the other thing that you were touching on is probably how are trees sort of cared for in the same way? So it's sort of as if trees, will they survive? And I think that boundary trees often, can be in for a bit of a problem. But I think that we are able to, kind of allow those boundary trees to continue growing. I think that hopefully they will survive. And I suppose the other thing you were talking about was, are new boundary trees being created in new developments? And I guess that's one that that only time will tell. So yeah, it's a good point. Interesting idea.
Can I suggest that if people want to put their videos back on, you're very welcome to, because of course it's nice to see who's in the room. Obviously, remember, it is being video recorded. So if you don't wish to appear in a video, don't switch it back on. We have a question from Kathy at 6:14. So early on in the talk, if Kathy's there, would you like to unmute yourself, Kathy, and ask your question?
Hello, Paul.
Hi, Kathy.
Hi, just trying to stop the video. Yeah, so just really interested in how these oaks survive, because I read in that book Wilding by Isabella Tree that oaks really suffered with having ploughing near them, and it seemed that tarmac is far more constricting than ploughing. So I was just fascinated how some of these trees survive with the tarmac right up to them. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, yes, good question. It seems miraculous is the best answer I can give you. I guess that most of them have only had tarmac up to the edge of them for less than 100 years. And if you think of the age of a tree, that's probably a relatively short time in the lifespan of a very old tree. So, for instance, that sweet chestnut in Putney, or the Little Gaines Lane tree in Upminster, have both been there for probably, they had 2 centuries with which they were in much more conducive conditions. So I suspect we're probably causing them problems now, but because they had such a good start in life, they're probably going to be okay. But I wouldn't be surprised if it does shorten their lifespans overall. And certainly that's something that would impact younger trees or newer trees that would, they would be in a much, because they have to deal with that straight away. That's why, often street trees won't last for that long. But I have to say, London plane trees are a good exception of a tree that's planted in the urban environment and will thrive in very difficult conditions.
Paul, there's a question which is really just a sort of kind of technical question. Do you know the approximate distance of your tree map spiral, asks Ruth, in terms of walking or cycling it?
Well, it's a good question. I'm going to paste a link to the map in the into the chat.
That would be a great idea. Yeah.
So maybe you could measure it. Google might even allow you to work that out, but I'd say it's a pretty long way. I'd say it's probably over 100 miles. When you think that the distance between Barnet and Upminster, that must be 15 miles. Upminster to Croydon, another 15 miles. So yeah, it's difficult to say, I'm afraid, but I reckon that it would be a long cycle to go from Barnet to Upminster, and probably quite a tricky one as well. It would be amazing if someone wanted to try it, though. I'd love to hear from them if they do in the future.
Okay, we've got literally a couple of minutes left. So one last question. Anyone who'd like to, you can try and raise a hand if you like, and ask a question, but if not, silence.
Oh, well, maybe this is a point where I can plug my books. So
Paul, over to Paul to plug his book. But first, what we've got to think about much more is that most of us would then, after we'd gone on a tour with Paul, we'd slope off to the pub and buy him a beer. Now, if you did spend and bought him a beer in a London pub, if you remember when you last visited, you wouldn't get much change from a £5. So what I'm going to suggest is you buy him a beer by donating to the festival. There you are. That's all it is. So over to Paul to do a bit of book plugging.
Yeah, well, thank you, Andrew. And yes, obviously the festival has sort of moved very much online this year due to the situation that we find ourselves in. But in many ways, that's allowed us to reach an audience that's much further afield. So I think it's really fascinating to have people that are interested in trees in London join from all over the world. So I hope you found it as interesting as people from London hope have as well, and whether it's given you an insight into the city and whether that rings true for your own cities and other places within the UK and further afield. So yeah, just wanted to mention my books, my London Street Trees, a field guide to the urban forest, has just been reissued as a second edition, expanded. There is the Great Trees of London map, which has a selection of 46 trees on it, not all of which are the ones which I selected today. So some of those appear on it, some of them don't. And then, of course, if you're interested in trekking through the forest, there is London is a Forest as well, which has 6 linear walks in it from the outer boroughs to the centre of town, going through places like Epping Forest, taking in some of the trees I've mentioned, like the High Barnet, the Monk and Hadley Oak, is where the book starts, and some of the other ones. The Wood Street Horse Chestnut features in it, but again, not all of them do. So it's a unique Street View collection that was devised because of the requirement to use Street View rather than actually go and show you these things, and try and add a bit of, as close as we could to some sense of being out in the street. But I think what Street View does, which is really fascinating, is able to go back in time and in the seasons. So if there's anybody else that's got any questions.
Oh no, Paul, wait a second. We have got one last question, and that's from, I just spotted it and lost it again. It was a question about the difference between timber and wood, which you said you were going to explain,
Yes.
and kind of swallowed it.
Yeah, well remembered, whoever came up with that one. But yes, so timber and wood are 2 very different products. So we have a rather different notion of what those 2 things are now. But in the days when woods would have been managed traditionally, and when coppicing and pollarding were actively employed in the woodlands around and in London, the product that would have been produced is what was known as wood, and that would be the small diameter poles that would be harvested from coppice or pollards, and they would have been harvested every 10 to 20 years, and that would have become firewood, and that would be and the woods around London and in London, their primary product was wood for burning, for Londoners' fuel. The other product from trees is timber, and timber is the big planks which would go into things like house building and shipbuilding, and very few trees in London would have been used for that. So most of the timber that would go into things like the naval dockyard down in Deptford, where Tudor vessels were built, or the hammer beam roof at Westminster Hall, dating from the 12th century, those types of uses of timber would be from wood or from trees that would have come from further afield. So there'd be a lot more effort in importing that into the city. Having said that, in most London woodlands, they were planted as coppice with standards. So that means lots of coppice, lots of low, regularly cut trees. Most of them would have been hornbeam, actually, which was the best wood for fuel. And the standards would be big trees which were allowed to grow up over them with a single trunk, and those would have been cut for timber. So hopefully that tells you about the difference between timber and wood, all explained in more detail in that book.
On that last clever, crafty way to plug the book, I think we'll call it come to a halt, but it's very difficult to give Paul a round of applause when you're on a Zoom meeting, but perhaps we can all go, great stuff, Paul.
Well, you could unmute everybody for a final hello and goodbye.
Okay, everyone suddenly gets for a clap.
Well, not necessarily a clap, it's just a sort of bit of humanity.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul.
My donation now.
Bye.
Okay. Come to other events during the festival. Do join in.
You will.
Thank you very much.
Amazing virtual background.